So we're going to be taking a look at the urban life during the Gilded Age, and our question for this particular unit is singular. It's to take a look at to the extent to which industrialization and urbanization was beneficial to the United States economy. And what we'll look at today, of course, will be more of a focus on urbanization, and we'll spend a little more time taking a look at New York City in particular, but I think we can generalize from there. There are some statistics, though, that I'm going to present that actually show what's going on in terms of the growth of the cities outside of New York and all across the country. So, as we're going through this presentation, I want you to think about this question right here, which is it working? Is it something that's going to be good for the economy and maybe even just good for society is another way of looking at this question. So, to give you and this is also statistics and characteristics. So I'm going to start with a little bit of not statistical information, but characteristics, so like an overview of what's happening. This is from a movie called Gangs of New York, and Gangs of New York takes place during the draft riots of the Civil War. And at the very end of the film, they have this amazing shot that I think really shows you visually the growth of New York City after the Civil War, which is the period that we're talking about. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to get you to that spot. So there they are. It's the end of the draft riots. It's a cemetery looking out onto New York City. It's actually the very end of the film. So they slowly fade in. The Brooklyn Bridge predates this, is in this period. It's in a major advancement of its time, engineering wise, connecting New York City to Brooklyn. And then this is the growth of the city even after the Gilded Age and the Civil War, post Civil War era. It's astronomical. So that gives you a nice overview. So what's happening to American cities and to immigration patterns? We talk about the idea of waves when we talk about immigration. And there are two waves of immigration. There's the great wave that we went through prior, which is mostly German and Irish in the 1830s and 40s. And we get this second wave of immigration that happens in the mostly 1880s and 1890s. So taking a look at this, where are they mostly coming from? If you were to like generalize, they generally are more and more people are coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. So Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, basically the quick way to describe those people generally are Jews and Catholics. People coming in from Italy, predominantly Catholic, and people coming in from Eastern Europe, predominantly Jewish. And that causes all kinds of other problems. I mean, when the Catholics came in from Ireland, they ran into problems of people accusing them of having been controlled by the Pope. So the same thing is happening with the Italians. But now the Italians are a little bit darker and a little differently complected. And then take Jews, a completely different religion than even Christianity, the hegemonic religion at the time. So when you look at this, that's a major shift in immigration patterns. Why is it happening? I mean, mostly it's persecution that's taking place in their home countries, in particular Eastern and Southern and Europe. That's really where it's happening. It's not to say that German population isn't continuing to grow, but it's on the downturn. By 1890, we see that. And then the same thing with the Irish. But the big population shifts that are taking place are from Italy and from Southern and Eastern Europe in the 1880s, 1890s. Just look at those numbers. That's where people are really coming from. And this is the population patterns from 1870 to 1920. So it's the Gilded Age and then the turn of the century. And the idea here is just to say that, generally speaking, cities are growing pretty widely. And it's not every single city that exists in the United States at that time, but it's most of them. And now there's more and more that are further west as well. So there's also that other shift. But take a look at New York as an example and Philadelphia. In the 1870s, they're about on par with one another. But by 1900, there's clearly a shift that New York City is outpacing Philadelphia in terms of its population growth. And hence our focus on New York City, because it is one of the biggest cities of this time period. And even today, it's it's to generalize from New York City is to say something important, is not just to look at one city that's unimportant. It's like New York City is one of the biggest population shifts that are happening in the United States at the time. Of course, we see another great example of like kind of major growth is San Francisco or Cincinnati, which doubles by its population by the end 1920. I mean, it's not a million, populated city, but it's about doubled its population. San Francisco is more than doubled its population. Seattle, so a lot of these cities out west are growing pretty quickly. And this is done via percentage increase. So you can see where the percentage increases were the greatest, were in Seattle was the highest, and then Los Angeles, Portland, San Francisco. So people are moving further and further out west, Chicago, Midwest, but people are moving further and further out west. New York City grows, but it doesn't grow at the same rate as some of the other cities did that were further west. That's really where the big shift is happening, geographically speaking. People are moving into the cities, but they're also moving further out west. This gives you a sense of the urban population growth during the period. It's not to say necessarily that people are moving from rural areas into cities. It could just mean that there's more people immigrating into the country and then moving into the cities. It could also mean that both are happening. Likely it's both, but I think it's a lot more of that immigration pattern that's taking place. So this is percentage urban rural. You could just focus in on urban just to look at those numbers and see how they're going up, and rural is going down. By 1920, more people are living in urban areas than are living in rural areas. So that's a thing that's very notable. Historians often cite that as being a major shift that's taking place, and that's 1920. And these are all census years, so that's how we're getting this data. And then just another characteristic of what it might have been like to live in the cities. There was certainly a class system that we can take a look at. And this film, also by Martin Scorsese, the other one was too, The Gangs of New York, earlier period. But looking at this film, Age of Innocence, in this little clip, you kind of get a sense of the growth of the city as well. And you'll see it's kind of a little surprise at the very end. A writer wants to marry the Daniel Day-Lewis character, and they have to see her, the grandmother, before they could even consider going ahead with this marriage. So this is like high class New York City, old money New York City. There's a thing actually called old money and new money. They called it nouveau riche if you were new money. So a lot of the people that were just...
Though brownstone was the norm, she lived magisterially within a large house of controversial pale cream-colored stone in an inaccessible wilderness near the Central Park.
In an inaccessible wilderness by the park, Central Park, right? So you know what Central Park is. Maybe you've been there. Is it inaccessible today? Not at all. So you'll see this last shot, they kind of show you what that looks like.
The burden of her flesh had long since made it impossible for her to go up and down stairs. So with for life and passion in them, two...
I'm going to show you the very last part. So now they're leaving the house, and this will give you a perspective of what it might have been like to live very near Central Park at that time.
It's a mistake for Ellen to be seen parading up Fifth Avenue with Julius Fulford.
So Fifth Avenue. You've been on Fifth Avenue. That's, maybe you've been on Fifth Avenue. That's where a lot of stores are. But this is Fifth Avenue in the 1870s or so. Amazing. It's so cool. I mean, obviously he spends the entire time inside, never gives you an exterior shot until the very end. That's a filmmaker technique to kind of give you that little surprise at the very end. But I think it proves a nice historical point, which is that New York City at this point is not nearly that developed. I mean, these big houses stood alone by themselves in this period. That's how, and then over time, New York City grows by leaps and bounds. So that's from Age of Innocence. And I think that'll give you a nice understanding of some of the, the feeling of New York City at that time. Some things that are characteristics of the urbanization changes that are happening. Megapolises, so like not just small cities, but humongous cities in some ways connected towards one another. Mass transit is another big feature that happens in this period where there's more and more like subways or L lines or things like that. It also becomes a magnet for economic and social opportunities. So, like, in order to get ahead in life, you kind of think of yourself as wanting to move towards the cities. And of course, there were clearly pronounced class distinctions. So that's upper class New York. Later on in class, we'll show you some of the different part of New York, the underbelly of New York. It became a new frontier for women because women have this sense of independence within the city. They can walk around unchaperoned in some cases. There were many squalid living conditions for some, and then the opulent conditions for others. There was a development of political machines. So political machine in particular, like Boss Tweed, people who aren't necessarily in power but control the strings of power behind the scenes. So corruption, basically, sometimes taking money away from public programs. And a thing they called graft, taking a little bit off the top. And then finally, ethnic enclaves or neighborhoods where you get like Little Italy or Chinatown. Those are some characteristics of a lot of these cities that exist in the time. So those are some statistics and characteristics of cities in this period.